Hello, everybody. Welcome to Joe the Lawyer. I'm your host, Joe Pometto. Today, we're going to take a look at the sentencing of Derek Chauvin, the man who was convicted of murdering George Floyd. Most of you probably heard Mr. Chauvin was sentenced to 22 and a half years in prison for killing George Floyd. I'm going to take a look at whether this sentence was fair. Was it too much? Was it too little? And also, what else is in store for Derek Chauvin as far as criminal charges that he is facing. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Joe Pometto, Joe the Lawyer. If you like my content, please like, subscribe, comment, and share. Also, consider signing up for my email list. You will get a free PDF on what to do when stopped by the police. Finally, I have a new channel. It's called Tips from a Lawyer. Check it out. You'll get practical legal advice, whereas on this channel, I mostly follow current legal topics. Okay, so we're going to kick off by watching a video about the sentencing of Derek Chauvin, and then I'm going to offer some analysis from a real criminal defense attorney.
The site in Minneapolis where George Floyd was killed became a magnet for tourists and locals this weekend following the sentencing of Derek Chauvin.
A period of 270 months. That's 270.
The former Minneapolis police officer was given a 22-and-a-half-year sentence for the killing of Floyd. With good behavior, Chauvin could be out on parole after about 15 years. Appearing on ABC's This Week, Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison called the sentence appropriate.
Look, it's 10 years beyond the guideline sentence. The recommended guideline sentence is 12 and a half. We got 22 and a half. And I think that the judge is right, given the particular cruelty, the abuse of trust, committing this crime in a group in front of kids.
The maximum possible prison term was 40 years. Juror Brandon Mitchell told Newsy's sister network Court TV he thought the sentence could have been tougher.
I think the judge did what's fair, but I do think it's a little bit light. I think that I know the prosecution was asking for 30. I thought 25 to 30 would have been fair as well.
It's not clear where Chauvin will serve his time, but he's currently at Minnesota's only maximum security prison in Oak Park Heights. He's alone in a 10 by 10 foot cell and only allowed out for an hour a day to exercise. He can have 10 photos, a radio, and food from the canteen. Attorney Ben Crump said the Floyd family is hoping Chauvin gets a longer sentence at his federal civil rights trial, expected to begin next year.
I'm shocked that it wasn't a longer sentence, but it is a beginning, and I want us to continue this fight and not give up.
So that's the relevant part. The rest of it is talking about the possible passage of a George Floyd Act. So you heard Attorney General Keith Ellison, Attorney General of Minnesota, there offer an opinion. He said that he believed that the sentence was appropriate in many ways. You also heard a juror who said that he did not believe it was appropriate. He thought that he said it was fair, but too light. I'm not quite sure what that means. I mean, if it's fair, it's fair. If it's not fair, it's not fair. Anyways, let's take a little harder look at the law here. So the crime that he was convicted of, which I believe was second-degree murder, okay, given Derek Chauvin any past criminal record that he has, which I think is 0, the recommended guideline sentence was 12 and a half years. He got 22 and a half years. What the guideline means is that's a spectrum of sentencing that is offered to the judge, where the legislature has written into law recommendations. So for example, it might be 10 to 20 or 20 to 30. In this case, the recommendation would have been 12 and a half, and he got 22. So the recommendation was 12 and a half. The maximum, I believe they said, was 30, and he got 22. So he actually got 10 years more than what the recommended sentence was for the crime that he committed. Just looking at the guidelines, that would tell you, well, this was actually a little bit harsher than what what you would expect in a similar situation for someone convicted of this crime. The judge gave him 22 and a half years. Again, that's between 12 and a half and 30, which is the maximum. However, I did some additional research. There's been a lot of publications out here. And in the past 10 years or so, there have been about a dozen or so police officers who were convicted of similar crimes. And the average sentence, guess what the average sentence was for those police officers? It was actually 21.7 years. So this judge here in Minnesota gave Derek Chauvin 22 and a half, just a little bit more than the average sentence that officers in similar situations to Derek Chauvin have received around the country. And when you bring that context in, it makes the sentence appear to be even more fair. Now, I understand that there is there is just tremendous outrage here amongst the just the entire country almost over what happened. But the important thing about the law is that there's a reason that when we see whoever it is, Mother Justice holding the scale and she's blindfold, justice has to be blind. So justice can't take into account just emotions, etc., etc. It has to be fair. It has to be blind. And the 22 and a half applied here was actually a bit more strict than the average people in this situation, across the country. So that tells me that this sentence was likely a very fair sentence. Now, I said originally, I believe that he would get between 10 to 15 years because I was relying on the guidelines, and like Attorney Ellison said, I figured it would be somewhere in the middle of the guidelines, like a 12 and a half year sentence, because that's what judges do most of the time. But it appears that this judge, he tagged 10 years onto that. So he definitely did take into account the egregiousness of the crime. Okay, so the sentence is 22 and a half. But here's the interesting thing. He's eligible for parole at 15 years. And I think Chauvin is maybe around 50 years old. I'd have to look it up real quick. He's around 50 years old. I didn't research that. If he does 20 years or so, he'll be well into his 70s, and he could, in fact, die in jail. So this could turn out to be a life sentence for him. Even though he would likely get out and still have some time left to live his life. I don't know for sure. We'll see what happens. But he can get out at 15 years. Now, at 15 years, the parole board will take a look, and they take into factors like the egregiousness of the crime, but also how well he does his time while he is in prison. So does he get into fights? Does he take part in programs? Has he been productive as an inmate? Has he exhibited changes in his life and in his character? And if he's able to do that, it's possible that he gets paroled at 15. My estimate here would be that he wouldn't be paroled at 15, but I also don't think he'd do the full 22 and a half. I think you're probably looking at a 17 to 18 year sentence total here for Derek Chauvin, and that would mean he gets out around when he's about 70 years old, and he might be able to get to live in his 70s and 80s as a free man. That's a long time away from now. Now, the interesting twist to this case is that he's also charged with federal civil rights crimes, okay? And I could, but I'm not going to in this video because I just want to talk about what his sentencing will be. He's charged under Section 242, which you can see here. The criminal code says the defendant's found guilty of causing bodily injury under Code 242, which would be the root of it is a deprivation of civil rights, of Mr. Floyd's civil rights, okay, for 1 to 10, he can be sent in prison for 1 to 10 years. But defendants whose actions result in death can be sentenced to prison for any number of years, up to a life sentence or even sentenced to death. For cases in which the defendant has already been sentenced to imprisonment in state court, a judge typically will rule the federal sentence should be served concurrently at the same time but judges do have discretion. So Derek Chauvin's going to have, we're going to run through this whole trial again, okay, in federal court to see if Mr. Floyd was deprived of his civil rights. He'll likely be found guilty again, but he will likely get a sentence around the same time, maybe a little less, maybe a little more than the sentence he already got in state court. So that could jam him up. My estimate would be, though, it'll be a couple years less or a couple years more. Considering it resulted in death, though, we could be looking at a sentence longer than 10 years. However, because it comes from the same transaction, that will be the key factor for the federal judge. Was the deprivation of rights the same transaction that resulted in the conviction at the state court? Because what judges don't generally like to do is sentence people twice for the same transaction, even though they could be guilty of multiple crimes, right? Because like a murder is also an assault, it's also harassment, things like that. And this is going to be seen as similar because it came from the same transaction. That's why this article states that he will likely get concurrent time for the federal civil case. However, Mr. Chauvin is also charged with this federal violation here, Section 242, deprivation of civil rights, for an incident in 2017 involving a minor where he allegedly choked a minor, hit him in the head, grabbed his neck again, hit him in the head, and then I believe put his knee on his back and restrained him for about 17 minutes. Okay, and that resulted in bodily injury to this minor. Now, I don't know that much about that case. I don't know if he was charged before George Floyd. I think he was actually charged after the George Floyd incident, which tells you a lot about this situation. But that's a separate transaction and a separate trial. And if he is convicted in that trial, that sentence, because it's a different transaction, will likely result in a sentence that would be run consecutive to the sentence that he's serving for the death of George Floyd. So here is the likely scenario. In state court, he was convicted, second-degree homicide. Judge sentenced him to 22 and a half years for the death of George Floyd, the killing of George Floyd. He will now face trial in federal court for that same transaction, under 242, but the actual crime is deprivation of civil rights. He will likely get a similar sentence, 10 to 20 years, maybe a little over 22 and a half, maybe a little bit more. However, that's likely to run concurrent, right, together because it came from the same incident. This is just how judges generally apply the law. But Mr. Chauvin has another case from a separate transaction, an entirely separate transaction where he allegedly deprived the rights of a child in 2017. If he gets a sentence on that, which is only bodily injury, so it's not death, so it would be 1 to 10 years, that will tag on top of his 22 and a half. So this case is long from over. Well, I don't want to say this case. The Derek Chauvin saga is not over yet. There's 2 more trials to go through. If he loses the trial with the minor is a bigger deal to him as far as his life is concerned than the second trial of George Floyd, because the trial of the minor will give him prison time that will almost certainly run on top of the prison time he already has. So let's say in the second federal case for George Floyd, he's doing 22 and a half. Let's say the judge gives him 23 and a half to run consecutive. Now he's doing to run concurrent, same time. Concurrent means same time. Now he's doing 23 and a half. Then he loses the trial with the minor. Let's say he gets 5-7 years. That seems likely on a case like that. All of a sudden, Chauvin's getting a 30-year sentence, which was the maximum for the state case against him in the killing of George Floyd to begin with. So it's unlikely Derek Chauvin gets to be a free man probably until his 80s. Although again, he may be eligible for parole earlier on that case as well. So let's say he's eligible on the state case at 15 years. He's eligible on the federal case another 5 years after that. He'll probably do 20. He might end up doing 25 or so, 20 to 25 instead of 15 to 20 because of these other cases. That's my prediction, that he ends up somewhere in that range at the end of the day, doing 20 to 25 years in prison. He'll be, I believe he's around in his 50s, so maybe 70 years old when he gets out. I think this judge, considering the national data for similar crimes, probably hit this right on the head. 22 and a half, a little bit more than 21.7, which is the national average. He didn't go too much more because this was a big national story, and he didn't go less than the average either. So it's hard to argue that he was too lenient. I thought this judge was pretty fair throughout the proceedings, and I would have to say he pretty much hit it on the head here. But the story's not over for Derek Chauvin. I hope you enjoyed this video. Joe Pometto, Joe the Lawyer. If you like my content, please like, subscribe, comment, and share. If there's a legal subject you want me to cover on here, something in the news, leave it in the comments or shoot me an email. It's in the link below. Also, check out my channel, Tips from a Lawyer. That's where I'm going to give you the practical legal advice. Here, I break down legal news. All right, everybody. That channel is in the description below. Thank you for tuning in. Joe the Lawyer out.